Yeah, I mean, I like Fletcher Pratt. Well, he's not that well known anymore, and it's
Mhm.
nice to know you're doing something about him. That's great.
Absolutely. We have to
Yeah,
honor everybody who
Yeah.
paved the way, right?
Got my book right
yeah,
here.
absolutely. Yeah.
You do.
Well, I think he and Spray de Camp between them did some great. I mean, they're certainly amongst my favorites, if not my. I mean, I love them. Yeah, great, good. Okay, well, I look forward to that.
All right. Well, welcome to the Sanctum Secorum podcast, where we plumb the depths of Appendix N as it pertains to the Dungeon Crawl Classics role-playing game. We're here to help you serve these literary offerings at your DCC RPG tables. I'm Keeper Marc, and with me tonight are Keeper Bob.
Hey, everybody.
And Keeper Jen.
Good evening.
And hopefully that lovely intro gave you a clue as to what we are reading. Tonight, we are examining the singular work by Fletcher Pratt, The Blue Star. Bob, do you want to give us a little bit of a synopsis?
I'll try. Lillette Asterhax could not escape her destiny. She was a hereditary witch in a world where witchcraft was banned by ecclesiastical and temporal powers, and any man who possessed her would then gain possession of her precious blue star and all of the powers it could bestow. Rodford Berglund was a reluctant revolutionary, a rogue who had a date with destiny. Although he lusted after a rich baron's daughter, Rodvard was ordered to seduce the witch maiden. Then all the magical powers of that strange blue jewel would be his for as long as he remained faithful to Lillette. And wow.
Was it just me, or was it hard to identify with either of the main characters?
I mean, they're anti-heroes, right? Both of them. You think that Lillette is going to be the sort of more sympathetic one, and in many ways she is, but she has this temper and anger problem that comes out in various ways, and even has this murder that happens because of it. I think they're both positioned as humans, flawed and all, but kind of caught up in these circumstances that they're unwilling participants in some ways.
Well, and I think it's fair to point out that if you're sitting down to read a fantasy novel or sword and sorcery novel, this is not what you would expect. This kind of reminds me of like The Worm Ouroboros and things of that nature, where it's definitely, this is not sword and sorcery. This is not high fantasy. It's almost philosophical fantasy in a way.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the flaws of the characters are kind of reflected of Fletcher Pratt himself. I mean, this is a guy that when he was sent off to college was arrested for burglary after a whole slew of like midnight cash drawer robberies. And then to avoid him necessarily going to jail, his father had him institutionalized. So, I mean, Fletcher Pratt had a very interesting bit of background, and I think perhaps the sort of people that he met in his youth are reflected in some of his writings.
I mean, Lynn Carter considered this to be one of Pratt's more thoughtfully conceived works. So
I would say it's definitely thoughtfully conceived. It really is. I mean, it reads more. I think it reads more like a treatise on fantasy politics and religion, perhaps in comparison to our own, right? Than a fantasy novel. It's a thought experiment, and I think the introduction and epilogue reflect that with the three characters sitting around, literally talking about a thought experiment about what a world would be like if, rather than sciences, it had advanced in something else. So it on an intellectual and philosophical level, it's very, very interesting, but it's not the sort, you are not going to be confronted with a hero with mighty thews hacking through his opponents with battle axes. It's not that sort of fantasy.
Yeah, I mean, there's this sort of, the the fantasy novel is an escapist, right? It's very much a let's enjoy this sort of experience, but there is very much a thread going through a lot of science fiction and fantasy about this kind of morality play, right? Trying to have an analog in a situation that you can present it where it is, easier to digest or to present, in a way that's not, something that's not beating it over your head. This beats it over your head a little bit, it sort of exposes it a little bit more in terms of like what the direct is. It's like we have these philosophers that set up the story, they dream, and this obviously has clear analogs throughout the story that that we this world experience. You have a lot of this sort of revolutionary concepts and machinations, and there's even like different races that are sort of like sort of thinly veiled references. And then at the end it's sort of like, yeah, we all had this thing and we wonder what happened to them, and oh, are we real ourselves, right? That's sort of like odd line at the end. And like I said, it's sort of like a very heavy hitting way of approaching that versus sort of like a more escapist. But I think it's sort of on that one of those ends of those spectrums, for all these kind of science fiction and fantasy things.
Certainly. Well, and like I said, having read The Worm Ouroboros, I really see parallels there. And according to Lynn Carter, Pratt was a big fan of that book. And I think my biggest complaint with The Worm Ouroboros is the intro. And in this case, it's not. In The Worm Ouroboros, they introduce a character that walks into like the king's throne room on Venus at a party and is never mentioned again, and it really doesn't seem to lead to anything, nor does it even really set up the book, its location, or its plot. Where here we have a similar kind of outsider introduction, but in the grand scope of things, it makes sense. It's kind of the author introducing his thought processes. And
there's
so,
a lot of sex in those thought processes.
Yes, it is. This book is kind of creepy.
I mean, this is just general, content warning for anybody who has not read this book, who may have, triggers or not appreciate, that this is of its time, right? I think it's very much, in the kind of same condition. Yeah. But there is a date scene that's very early in the novel, and that is
at least
something
one.
I got to that point. I was like, I'm putting this book down for a while, and I have to reapproach this.
Well,
now,
and
before we move too far off the prologue, I actually found the prologue to be the toughest part of this entire book to digest, because I don't come from a philosophy student point of view. However, I will say it drew the pretense right up front of everything being surrounded by superstition, lying, and plain ignorance. And I have to draw that parallel between that and the trying to build this world without giving any context of, okay, so she's this race. Great, what does that mean? Right. Can you expound on this a little, please? Otherwise, I found it fairly whimsical, or at least it was trying to be, with the magic quotient to there.
Well, I just think it's cool that Fletcher Pratt was a gamer. Technically, he was a naval war gamer, but I mean, he created his own naval war game. They were all collected and published into a volume, Fletcher Pratt's Naval Wargaming with model ships from 1900 and 1945. I mean, you can buy the war game that Fletcher Pratt wrote and played. So he was of us before we were, right? I mean, there was no role-playing games to play.
And you can actually play Fletcher Pratt's naval game at GaryCon. They run it every year, if I recall correctly, right?
Oh, do they?
It's the big naval on the floor in the sand table room. So you see those people like on the floor with those ships. I think that's the Fletcher Pratt.
I'll have to check that out, because I mean,
that's really interesting, because even in this story, the biggest monsters at sea were actually on board the ship. So that could be an interesting game to play.
Well, I look at it as, but before there was D&D, before there was Blackmore, there was that period where wargamers were kind of winnowing things down to a single character and role playing a bit before anything was officially published. And I think Fletcher Pratt would have been right there along with him. I think he would have loved that. I think he was totally our kind of people. And it's just
The whole going crazy thing, right?
Yeah, it was very well. That was in his youth, and that was, I think, to keep him out of jail, right? I mean, get arrested for burglary. Yeah. He didn't have that conviction because he ended up like in the Navy and doing a number of other things. And he certainly traveled around a lot and did not stay where he was arrested. But I mean,
he had a circle of literary friends as well, right? The same sort of like.
Oh yeah.
He was very much part of that early science fiction fantasy, group of authors that were writing for these, magazines or pulp magazines, and then trying to get their own works published. And I know that there was a lot of references, in articles you read about him of, just how, like people would be in and out of his house, right? And just sort of exchanging ideas, and that obviously led to a lot of the sort of like role playing game elements that later would come. So.
Well, also, I mean, if you've read any Asimov and you're familiar with, I think is it the Black Widow Society? He's got a society named for spiders, and that's actually based on the Trapdoor Spiders, which was a group that Pratt had created. I mean, this is a man that at one point they were living in an old mansion on a cliff, and it was essentially just nonstop party where people came and went. So obviously money came from somewhere, but didn't have to be all that much. I remember when I lived in Vegas and we were poor, we had parties that would go for days. So, and we were poor, but booze was cheap and friends were plentiful. But yeah, it's just this great sort of dynamic. I mean, he read Norse sagas in the original language. Yeah. He read collections of obscure mythologies just for fun. And I think it shows in his writing. His writing isn't necessarily, it's not necessarily the most approachable, right? And this is a book that reads like it's older than it is. And we've read some books where like, gosh, this was written 80, 100 years ago, but it's not awkward. The language just flows, and it seems like it could have been written within the past 20 years. This does not. This is definitely something that you sit down to read.
This does feel older. Had the subject matter been more approachable, a little bit plainer, I think it would have been a much quicker and enjoyable read.
It would have been quicker. I think it would have lost some of its depth, though. It's kind of tough in that fashion, right? I mean,
it was kind of hit or miss. It didn't grip me, I guess, the way that it was trying to grip the reader with all of the court intrigue and the different judicial systems in the different lands. And
but again, this is where I think it gets to kind of a
target market.
No, well, and this is not a book for everybody, but I think that's where this is more a kind of a treatise on politics and religion and law, right? Because we're exposed to all these different legal systems, and essentially all of them are, we do it our way. We don't really care if you want us to do it your way. That's not how we do it, and then they still kind of do it horribly. And I think that's sort of a condemnation of the legal system in general, right? I think he makes some really solid points.
Well, we could just repeat: superstition, lying, plain ignorance.
Well, it's interesting because when I was reading this novel, there's that sort of like you jump into the deep end aspect that you're talking about, Jen, where it's like you don't have any context for who these people are, what this world is. You have to sort of discover all that, and it does create this sort of sense that outside the borders of this story, there is a much richer sort of world that he's got in his mind, and it does create, like to your point, Bob, that there's this depth to it. But what I was contrasting it to is that it's very similar to a lot of the Dying Earth stories, and many ways there is this sort of like, you know, these in Dying Earth, though, it's played for humor, right? You know, they have these kind of odd religions that are sort of presented for their absurdity, right? And I think Pratt is trying to do something similar, where every one of these countries, every one of these like religions has, you know, something that the main characters want to flee from, right? There's a rotten heart at the core of all these things, even when it's like, even with the god of love, you know, religion. They're, you know, how they approach work. It's like, you know, work, or work is prayer, and those kind of things. And in the end, you know, the way the characters do, they flee from all of that, right? That's sort of like their escape. Whereas, you know, Vance and Dying Earth, these things are very much a, you know, a thing of light touch and humor, which, you know, I think makes it easier to digest, you know, honestly. But it's very similar. So it's really odd. There's a lot of picaresque sort of like, you know, move and transitions from place to place. There's, you know, these odd religions and you know, villages and towns and things like that. And there's the anti-hero too, right? You know, we got Kugel in one sense, and we've got, you know, Rovaldo in the other. Yeah, I think it's just that's the hard thing for me to like sort of like get into, is that, you know, it is more of a hard stop, right, when you encounter in the Pratt version.
Well, and the other thing is, you know, this book is defined as part of the fantasy genre, but really to me it feels more like a general novel. We're never really given a whole lot that makes you weave one way or another on, oh well, this is reskinned, you know, medieval Germany, or, you know, feudal England. You know, there's a couple little things here or there, but for the most part, other than the fact that they don't have, you know, cars and steam engines, it really reminds me more of, I would say it reminds me more of Swift's Gulliver's Travels than it would remind me of, you know, Robert E. Howard's Conan, right? There's definitely some pointed commentary going on here, a little bit of political satire, but it's given this label of fantasy, which I think in the literary market diminishes it. I mean, because most people kind of turn their noses up at fantasy novels, right? I mean, that's why it's a small section of the bookstore and not the majority of the bookstore. And so I think it might have missed a large share of its target audience because they would never think to pick it up.
Also, because unlike most of his peers, this was never published in one of the magazines.
Yes, it was never in the pulps. And I don't know how well it would have gone over in the pulps, right? I mean, this is definitely not flashing swords and mighty thews.
It really felt more like a medievalish Zena Henderson. Like, there's some sort of mystique, but you never exactly find out what it is until maybe a page before the end.
You know, I would say that the comparison to the Space Amish would be a fair comparison. Yeah.
You know, especially because the thoughts from the Blue Star essentially performing its telepathy for you, all of the thoughts were in parentheticals. And I remember one of the biggest things about Zena Henderson's writing was that it was so sporadic, and that's what you're greeted with when you first meet Lilette, the main character here.
Yeah.
All of these thoughts in parentheses about her mom and during this conversation with her mother. So it's a little bit disjointed to begin with, but then it starts making itself known a little bit better. I guess that you get into the flow of it a little better.
Well,
Yeah,
I think
to read.
I was going to say they had an interesting sort of like, I guess, you know, sort of approach to it where, you know, it is a little like these parentheticals are a little bit like, oh, that's unusual. And it does like sort of alternate between Lilette's story and Rovaldo's story, you know, sort of back and forth. And those early in the parts, those are very long, right? Sort of, you know, expositions on each of those characters, and they get narrower and narrower and narrower until they're brought together, and then it's in those parentheticals actually interesting because they almost follow each other right in the same paragraph, and sometimes, and I like that as sort of like the device to show how their lives are sort of like now becoming so conjoined that their thoughts are almost, you know, in a sense they're present and next to each other.
About the size of each segment
Getting
sort of
kind of
like
narrowing
get
in.
funneled back together. Yeah.
But can we talk a second about the blue star and all of the powers that it possesses being one, right? I mean, well, I guess technically two, but he doesn't get to use the second one. It's just she knows if he cheats on her because it shuts off, right?
It has a lot of powers, but it has to be witched first. And I dig
it has one power and it needs to be witched first.
Witch is a verb. I love this. But Lilette is new. She doesn't know much magic. She was trying to avoid having to cast anything.
But we also encounter another.
She infused it with.
We encounter another blue star bearer, and he has exactly the same power, and that's it.
Well,
it does one thing.
What my understanding of it was is that it's specifically tied to when Lilette loses her virginity, she inherits the power from her mother.
Right.
There's like this sort of very, based
true.
on
society is very matriarchal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, but that blue star, I think there's an allusion to maybe another power where he has this sort of heightened perception, he says. It's not just like looking at somebody's eyes and telling you they're lying. He has this sort of like, awareness of things, but it's never, detailed out. But the whole rules around the blue star were very difficult for me to accept in some ways, because it's like, you lose it when you become unfaithful, but there's so many times that Revolta's having these like very lustful thoughts and these actions and things like that. But it's only when it crosses a specific line does the blue star turn off, which I found a little disenchanted with that whole concept after time that Revolta has this
and then there's
I'm pursuing this maid sort of Barry London style, or that's sort of like I'm having my adventures, but of course I don't lose the power until I and
then there's the whole, well, it does other things if you betray me, because if you betray me and I ask for it back, you must give it to me, because if you don't, it will forever curse you and be your doom. Is that good PR? And then we watch as everything goes to hell in a handbasket for him when he loses the connection to the blue star. I'm like, all right, now this could be coincidence, or maybe the stone really has this power.
He's extremely ill, and she can tell that.
Well, just like the other witch.
Now that I had a huge problem with.
The other witch is like, oh my God, his wife will know that I have bewitched him, and this, that, and that. Well, of course, spoiler alert: the blue star was already dead at that point. But
has no affiliation or attunement to this woman, but she's still allowed to turn it back on. I don't get that,
because it's just a matter of enchantment.
But I thought it was tied to the family line.
But the stone isn't, because they talk about the fact that people would certainly be willing to buy the stone and covet the stones and want them.
Okay.
So they're not bound in that fashion. It's just it takes a witch to power it.
I had it in my head that since it was a family heirloom.
Oh no, I was right there with you. It took me a minute to kind of wrap my brain around.
Okay, thank you.
Well, it's also this thing like the witches in this world have been suppressed, right? It's alternate history. Witchcraft developed, but at some point there was this counter movement against it, and essentially witches were eliminated. There's this sort of natural evolution of magic that peaks out, every once in a while. And it's sort of this weird sort of, it's tolerated. They can't outright, kill all of them, but they can't accept them into society. So there are still blue stars around. But it is confusing because the witch that that he encounters that tries to, essentially sell his body for parts or whatever it was,
right.
How did she get her powers, right? There's no blue star that her husband, says that he has or anything like that. Did she just learn it? And
they mentioned though
things because they were out on the outskirts and like
early in the book they mentioned that a lot of the blue stars have been lost over the generations. and have disappeared. So it's not that she's from outside the witching lineage so much as her family no longer has a blue star. It was
Well, that's true. She
why.
may have.
Well,
might
it
have
was
at
it
one
was
point.
why it was so important that Rodverd get together with Lilette, because Lilette's family had a blue star, or was
But
believed to have a blue star. They weren't even sure that they had it, and even Lilette's mother wasn't positive, right? Which is like,
Because
well,
she'd
it's
never
supposed to
opened the
be in
box.
here. Let's break this
Yeah.
open and see. So
Now, to Mark's point, I will say that the first third of this book, I got serious Hunchback of Notre Dame vibes off of it. The evil cleric and
Mhm.
the chasing the dark-skinned witch. Yeah.
well, this is on Appendix N, and I wonder if it's because it was foundational in some of the politics of Greyhawk, right? Because I
Oh.
mean, certainly you don't really see a lot of ties between this and D&D as just played, right? Or
Mhm.
gaming as played. So I wonder if it was influential in some of the backgrounds for gaming, because yeah, this is a heady read. This is not a sit down and watch people split in twain sort of thing.
I tried.
Oh,
More than one sitting.
It took me more than halfway through this book to really even switch gears. I mean, normally a book this size would be done in a few hours, and after a day's worth of reading, I was halfway through, and I was kind of slogging. And the reason I was slogging wasn't because of the writing style, it was because of my expectations, and this was not what I expected. And once I managed to switch gears, I was like, okay, we're using big brain now. Look at big concepts, and it
Nice.
became a much more entertaining read once I got to that point. Once I had an understanding for what I believe Fletcher Pratt was actually doing with the book, and I got it, I was all in.
I stuck with it because Uncle Mike said he liked it.
And at the end of the day, I enjoyed it as well. It's just, it's not going to be a book for everybody, just because it's not the fantasy novel that you're expecting. If you like the Worm Ouroboros or Gormenghast, you're going to like this book. If you don't, you might have issues with this book.
Well, now that we've pounded this book into the ground like it's the reading room or something, maybe we should get on to the gameable parts of this. Maybe.
Well, we needed to talk about the book a lot, because I don't know how much gameable stuff there really is in here.
Are you kidding?
No, not at least from where I was at. First of all, I thought the blue star itself, with the ability to read minds, becomes an interesting concept. As a judge at the table, I would have a villain with something like that, and I would represent it by the villain being able to listen in on all of the player table talk. He knows what they're thinking, so he's aware of all of that. It's a bit meta, but players spending 20 minutes to plan an attack is rather meta as well. So he understands what's going on in their minds and can respond accordingly. There was a comment about probability, and how just because something was possible didn't mean it was probable. And the exact quote was like, every molecule in a bottle, suddenly you're going in one direction. I was like, well, that'd be a great idea for a spell, something that affects probability. All molecules moving in one direction is a really big deal, and could do a lot of damage or inflict a lot of force. So that concept really kind of tickled my brain. And I was also sort of with Marc. I think overall this reminded me of Dying Earth, and everywhere you went there was strange customs and cultures, and working some of the religious interplay into the game might be interesting. I'm generally not a big fan of clerics that are like, well, my God is the only true God. You live in a world that people know gods multiple exist. You live in a polytheistic society, so you can't say that. That doesn't work. That doesn't fit the world. But when you're saying things like, according to my religion, this is the way, and your faith does it wrong, and here's why, okay, now you have my attention, right? And working stuff like that in could be kind of fun. Those are my ideas to pull from the table. What do you have, Mark?
Well, the interesting idea of how the spell casting is effectuated, where in witchery you trace a pattern, right, on some surface or even on a person. And I love that idea of, this sort of like contact and tracing and
the accidental casting.
And the accidental casting, yeah. So I think that's a very cool mechanic, just in terms of like you could add that for flavor. It could even create a table, right? Some, spell, like a spell burning like table where you say, this is how I'm doing my rune tracing, or this is just how I do it. I thought that was neat. There's a lot of curses that you could generate from this book.
Certainly.
There, at one point, there's a reference to having witched him to work like a clock. He doesn't, in the end, he doesn't have the skills to do this, but essentially that he's just become this sort of automaton where he has to just do things as ordered over and over again, and that's why he's worth more as this prisoner. Or like how she causes the Amorosian, who's on the ship with her, the third mate, to just she says, go away, almost like, power word command or something. And he just walks and walks until he walks off the ship, right? Which is it's a very much a, curse, but that turns out to be a spell at the same time. And then there's a reference to how she's been asked to essentially disable the bishop or the leader of the ecclesiasticals. And you can paralyze him, you can cripple him, you can drive him idiots. So these are kind of rich stews for new curses to be born out of.
Nice.
Bob, you mentioned like this sort of unexpected results. All of those things are triggered by her anger, it seemed, right? Where she's just in a flash of of anger or just frustration. She does something, and this unexpected consequence, like the murder, is one of the things. Or when she does the table and it shows she's a witch, and everybody has this big reaction. And I kind of love the idea of that being a thing that happens when you cast spells. You have to, or when you have a specific encounter, you have to make a personality check. Otherwise, you unleash some magical effect unwillingly, right? And
I would dig that as a mechanic.
Wow.
There
Yeah.
were points in the book where some people seem to have developed through almost mentat-like abilities, the ability to be immune to witchcraft, like the Amorosians, or I have this, or like the ones that are sort of like deacons, or the higher level ones in the hierarchy. They can't be read by the blue star, and they there's a reference saying 9 times out of 10 your witchery won't work on them. So they've almost made themselves through thought process or through the devotion to their church, their religion, this immunity.
Yeah.
And that's kind of an interesting sort of in a world where witchery has sort of been suppressed, but what about a fantasy world where there's all these kind of like magic of it? You can specialize in tuning yourselves to avoid the effects of one type of thing. Maybe that's something you could use as an interesting device. The last thing I had, which is you mentioned that Fletcher Pratt, where did the money come from? This book is, in addition to like lust and sex and all those things, there's a lot of focus on money and poverty, and the characters not having enough resources. And when they do, they go across the world, and they try to use their currency that what little they have, and it's rejected as almost against the law. I think there's like a point where they say that. And I thought that was a fun thing that you could introduce in a campaign where there is no sort of universal gold or silver piece or copper piece. You're going to have all these different kingdoms representing their own sort of like stamp, and taking that across the border. Maybe there is a reason that you can't use it at all, right? So your accumulated wealth that you may have gotten from an orc horde, you can't use it because you're in the wrong place, and now you have another travel or quest that you have to go to actually be able to spend this coin, or maybe somebody can only buy it off you for pennies on the dollar. I thought
Gosh.
that's kind of a fun
Yeah,
thing
maybe
that,
it's seen as paraphernalia. Yeah.
Well,
exactly.
that reminds you. There was a podcast I've listened to called A Voice from Darkness, and they've got kind of this side story with this weird kind of parallel space that you can find yourself in, and it is the city of Farbotia, and this map maker from our world wanders through. He walks this way, one way on a road, but you if you walk back, it doesn't take you the same way. And everyone thinks he's from Farbotia. So while he's trying to pay, it's bad luck to take Farbosian money. Your money's literally not good here. So by custom or superstition, that I think would be a real eye-opening moment for players. And like, okay, well, we're going to go to the tavern. We're going to get some drinks. We're going to rent a room so you have a place to stay for the night. Oh, no. We can't take that here.
Yeah, and suddenly you have to come up with another way of paying, we're working your wages, which, or accepting that quest you would never have accepted before, because you need the money. That's a good adventure hook thing.
Yeah. Oh, I dig that.
What about you, Jen?
I'm sitting back here grinning and chiming in and nodding vigorously because I have played in that game where poverty was a major character from the beginning. Andy Markham ran us through a great Shutter Mountains campaign, and what you had on your 0 level starting character was what you had. Full stop. There's no shop that's got this. If you, for instance, wanting any sort of hide armor, well, you've got to go find the cow, You might find some really thick pieces of leather from one of the last butcheries, and maybe you can work in exchange to get this from somebody, or you can do them a favor, but you can't buy it. You don't have any gold. You can't, you could steal it, but there's a lot more of them than there are of you. So how do you work that into it? And it was run beautifully.
That's a really good way of putting it too, that poverty is a character in the campaign.
Hats off to Andy. I mean, he rocked it for a year and a half. Hey, a lot of good things did come out of the pandemic. Who knew? I see the entirety of this book, though, as just a mine of settings and NPCs that you can create. Most important off of that conversation would be a spell or a ritual of some sort to convert or exchange currency from one to another. Make your money good here now instead of not good. Wow, that was articulate, Jen. Another thing that really caught my attention and my imagination were the costumes that had been infused with personalities.
Oh, yeah.
By the boy who had basically almost been orphaned because his mom
You've been babysat by the costumes, yeah.
And I thought that could be just perfectly creepy. There's enough adventures around that have like taxidermied animals. What if they're actually just characters, not monsters, but characters with personalities, and they could have any sort of properties or qualities, just like a sword.
Yeah, I can see that.
Maybe they have the patron. If you look at the annual, they've got the rules for like the patron swords, things of that nature, where the personality is actually trapped within. So I thought that could be really fun.
Yeah, there were some cute moments like that in the book that, like, I thought, oh, that's really nice. That little the boy who made stories about the mask. I like that quite a bit.
Oh, you're back. You're so and so, but you're not cold anymore. I liked that.
Yeah, well, and the whole, he killed her when the guy knocks the head off of the dummy wearing the costume. No, what the spirit in the head is gone now. If Mom makes it a new head, it will be someone else.
but
Yeah, there was kind of a
you know, witchery
poignancy
was
that
bad in
takes
that
place.
house, supposedly. Yeah, a little gray there.
It was a sad kid.
Poor little dude. Yeah. All right, that's it for me.
Well, then, what do you have for props and audio?
I think we should all invest in stuffed lizards.
Okay, you can't just leave that
I
hanging
mean,
for
I
the
could.
listeners.
No, the stuffed lizards hung above establishments to denote that someone within practiced the art medic.
Yeah.
So you're looking for a healer, you're looking for a stuffed lizard. And I've heard somebody refer to that before, so now I get it.
Hmm.
Mark?
I went immediately to the badges that are worn by the different NPCs, as you said, Jen. And I thought, one interesting thing you do is suddenly evoking the status in a role-playing moment is by having the PCs wear analogs, right? Or the players wear analogs, where that's you are a coronet, so you are of the nobility, and you are mechanician, so you're sort of these stratas that are defined. And as a judge, you can use that for the interactions, right? So there's a difference, from somebody of one strata or one background coming, that's there, and they have to. I think the badges sort of reinforce that in a role-playing sense, and so I think making up badges and distributing to the players for like kind of fun role-playing elements would be kind of cool. And that leads us to our regular section of music that Bob is on my list over.
Well, okay, so I
Yeah.
posted the link to the Spotify list, which is about 6.5 hours by the time I was done.
We left you alone for too long. Sorry.
So there, because there's sort of this timeless quality to the book and to the setting. My brain kind of drifted to Venetian music from the Renaissance. So I started with like Venezia I can say this. Venezia Stravagantissima.
Brava.
Which is a great album. Dance music through the ages, specifically disc 2. String Quartet number 8, opus 110 by Dmitri Shostakovich. And so that was kind of my starting point. I had some great kind of moody Venetian music, some of it dance, some of it kind of dark. And from there, my brain went, this is not the music that the majority of the DCC community is going to listen to. Not that they won't listen to classical. It's just not the primary choice of a lot of folks.
Glad you picked up on that.
And so I then drifted into neoclassical, which as a genre is more a genre among guitarists, but they're guitarists you would know. So things like the Concerto for Group and Orchestra by Deep Purple, Concerto Suite for Electric Guitar and Orchestra in E-flat minor by Yngwie Malmsteen, Perpetual Burn by Jason Becker from Cacophony and Megadeth, Instrumental Variations by David Chastain, Neoclassical Compositions number 2, Duets by David Chastain, some Vinnie Moore, who played with Alice Cooper and I think plays with UFO now, Time Odyssey and The Maze, Chromaticity by Tony McAlpine. Yeah, and I mean, he played with Steve Vai, Vinnie Moore, Planet X.
It's Chromaticity, Bob.
Chromaticity, there we are.
Yes.
Inquisition Symphony by Apocalyptica, which covers Metallica, Smashing Pumpkins, Faith No More, and more in this neoclassical style. And then just because when I think of classical music with any sort of like metal at all, I think of Beethoven in Bill and Ted and Play With Me by Extreme, right? I mean, which the album version is different from what you see on the screen, but yeah, come on, right? I mean, that scene just so sort of defines layperson's understanding of neoclassical music, and is a great sort of
Fair.
entry point in the movie. Not so much on the album, but in the movie, it's a great entry point. And really, I mean, you can't go wrong with any of those artists. I mean, you could listen to Yngwie Malmsteen for days. Granted,
Right.
listening to Yngwie Malmsteen for days would also be like listening to a hummingbird for days because he can play so fast. But it's good stuff. And for me, that sort of captured the vibe from this ethereal Renaissance era music to a more modern interpretation.
Out of curiosity, did you pick these selections after day one of reading or after reading the entire thing?
It was during day two. Day two, like I said, day one of reading, I mean, 8 hours, right? 8 hours to get through half the book. It took me about 2 to get through the other half.
Okay.
So the first half of the book was just really rough. But once it switched for me, it was sort of like when I read Asimov's Foundation. I was about halfway through the first book when all of a sudden something switched on my brain and I grokked it. And at that point, that's when I was able to start thinking, okay, now music, and I started getting a feel for how I perceived that world. So, yes.
List, yeah, I think it does capture it. You know, and
So speaking of capturing, let's talk about language. Professor Marc.
Speaking of chromaticity.
This was a very rich stew of words for us to draw from, or that I really found intriguing. It's very much akin to wordsmiths like Vance, and we kind of made those kind of comparisons before. It's reinforced by the words because there's so many, you know, either new words, you know, that he's making up, or just like obscure words that you run across, you look up the definition and go, how did he know this? Like, how is it the Norse that he's reading in the original that's lending himself to this? But it's obviously, you know, he very much, you know, has this appreciation for works of a time period, and a lot of these words that, you know, are in here are sort of have that European sort of, you know, aspect to them, you know, like almost courtly in many ways, or Italian Renaissance. But I think I wrote down 20 or 25 of them, just as a few examples. Enkleost,
Just a few.
Bargle, the other, what is it? Couvertine.
Wait, Bargle can be used without argle preceding it? It has other uses than just argle bargle?
The Demosil, you know, which is this sort of, it's a very pretty word, but that's like the common name for every lady, you know, of a certain status in the work. Dompter, which, you know, there's this great sort of sentence where one of the NPCs that you talked about, Jen, that is a more flavorful or colorful character is Salad Deer. I think, I can't remember, but he's the swordsman, you know, that escorts them around the last few chapters. And he's got this very much a swashbuckling, you know, roguish, you know, sort of aspect to him. But he's very cheerful, and he greets them, you know, by saying, "Hail, dauntless dompter of the written page," and dompter means
Yeah.
subduer or tamer, and so those kind of wordplay things are very much, you know, something that you can tell Pratt is having fun with. So the whole list, yeah, I think we'll try to, hopefully we can, you know, include it in the show notes. There is a lot, and
there's one on your list I think is definitely worth mentioning, though, that you are not mentioning. Well, we did just cover a book set in Pellucidar, and pellucid is one of your words, Marc.
Yes, that's right.
Isn't it clear? Is the meaning of it? Like
transmitting or allowing the passage of light, translucent, transparent.
Yeah. My favorite was glyptics.
I didn't have that on my list. I think that was one I probably just passed over, saying that's got to be a made up word.
Hey.
But it was fun. It was fun
I should have had it
from just
ready.
the aspect
Sorry.
of discovering new words, and some of these I'm like, I have to use that in some future writing project, just because it's just too fun, you know, not to.
Dying Earth Box 2.
Again.
Meretricious.
Yes, that's a very much a Vancian Kugel type word. And then just also like along the same veins, he's very creative when it comes to creating new names for places or titles and things like that. It's very much invented in ways like tokens or invented language. I appreciated that the work that sort of went into that to make it seem not so close to something that you're like, oh, that's obviously what it is, but also not like really an English word that you've come across before. And so it does create this sort of foreignness and richness to that foreignness that I appreciated. Well, enough wordsmithing. How about DCC?
Eclectics. It is the art of engraving on precious stones. I knew I'd get it.
How about we move on to reskins or inspirations?
Yeah,
Jen, do you have some in mind?
Yeah, I've got a bunch revolving around this world called DCC Linkmar. So many different scenes and settings in the story. So because of the heavy religious tones, of course, blasphemy and larceny, with the discussion of all of the other temples that might be along Temple Row there. Gang Lords of Lankmar is, you could have Rodvar's organization as one of the gangs in play for the goings on of this story. And I need to give a shout out to DCC Lankmar number 7. Unfortunately, it's out of print in hardcover or hard copy, but you can get it in PDF still. A dozen Lankmar locations because I swear they went through so many. The heist, the DCC Day Adventure, the heist was also set in Lankmar, but set in the grand, what was the word Pratt uses? Pensionario?
Yes.
Yeah, so kind of a palace, kind of the old, the rich quarter. The pensionario itself, now that I think about it, was in the higher class district, but was still kind of a boarding house. So maybe not quite so word for word on that one. Going back to the pilgrimage for each of the different religions in Dying Earth. Marc, Pilgrims of the Black Obelisk, come on. And the last one that comes to mind through all of this, as it often does during a setting of this nature, especially with poverty being its own character and things like clothing being so difficult to find even. Theater of the Hand, where you are encouraged to play dress up and talk to the talking animals and go through the little quests so that you can actually get something to eat at the end of the day.
And a great adventure.
And that one's by Clint Bahady from Order of the Quill. What about you, Marc?
My mind went to Shutter Mountains pretty quickly, just because the broad sort of world that you have with that campaign setting, obviously the witching and the sort of this folkloric magic, right? That's not high fantasy magic. It's very much in the vein that Michael Curtis, who wrote most of the Shutter Mountains materials, and starting with the Chain Coffin, that's what's drawing from in the Appalachian, sort of analog setting. So I think you could easily take a Shutter Mountain, rules and setting and reskin it for this Pratt world, and maybe there is a suppression of witching and witchcraft. Maybe there's outlawed devices and artifacts that are kept close watch on, etc. But yeah, that's something that I think would be easy to do. I also thought of A Miracle Was Framed, another Michael Curtis one, because it's a nice sort of early city setting, right? You know, where you have this,
Yeah.
you know, intrigue with the you know, the tower that you have to go into, but you have to align yourselves with these, you know, the city organization. And so you could make
Yeah.
that sort of a mini sort of, you know, version of, you know, Dosola, you know, the country, or, you know, that they're in. I can't remember if that's how you
Yeah.
pronounce it.
Desolate. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think you could, you know, sort of easily sort of play that into, well, you know, what this is a obvious sort of affront against the religion, so we have to go and put it out, and, you know, the adventurers are called to action to do that. And the last I was going to call out is there's a short sort of setting slash, you know, probably interlude adventure called Through the Cotillion of Hours by Daniel Bishop. And what made me think of this is that there's a sort of, you're in a dream world, right? You know, this is sort of the way this adventure works. And without revealing too much, you know, that's sort of the setting, you know, within the Pratt novel. You can use that sort of as a conveyance, right, for your players, your PCs, to get into this alternate reality that's set up in Daniel's work. There's also a masquerade, right? You know, sort of like, you know, there's a period in the Pratt novel where the Blue Star, where they're in a ball, and there's obviously this sort of high society, you know, sort of aspect to it, and those intrigues that are going around. So you can easily take, you know, sort of that masquerade setting and layer it in, and, you know, have the NPCs, you know, with their machinations interacting with the PCs, and the players reacting to that. So that's one that just shouting out, because I think it's one of those early you know, versions of DCC adventures that doesn't get as much attention as some of the later ones. So definitely go check it out. I think it's Purple Duck Games that was published under, like all of Daniel's other, you know, a lot of his works. I'd say, you know, if you had an idea in DCC, there's a good chance Daniel got there first. So just go back and read a lot of what he's written. It's all
fair.
perfect. What about you, Bob?
Well, you know, first of all, I've got to say that, you know, I hadn't even considered Lankmar, and I really should have. I mean, the first like 50 pages of the book are using the laying low mechanic from DCC Lankmar, right? I mean, I wrote Blasphemy and Larceny and Lankmar, and I did not think of overlaying anything with that. I kind of went for broad strokes for most of the stuff that I was thinking about. The 998th Conclave of Wizards is really, it's less of an adventure and more of a mini setting. I mean, there is kind of an adventure thread that you can play through, but it really is, it's the city, it's the factions, it's all the weird individuals. And for me, that was very, very ripe for inserting some Fletcher Pratt and some Blue Star. Especially when you start dealing with the servants of the various wizards and their factions. DCC Dying Earth as kind of a whole, as we discussed. Well, I think we're all in agreement with that. I mean, we all mentioned it at different times. I'm just the one that literally mentioned it in the reskin section. And I would say that while I didn't think of Blasphemy and Larceny, I did think of Magnific Machinations at the Grand Exposition of Marvels, because of all of the various factions and kind of the backbiting that goes on within the first half of the adventure, the setup for the heist.
Yeah, it's a very much like a microcosm, you know, of what, you know, the sort of like broader thing, because it's so you know, part of this like one little area. But you're right, it's a lovely adventure for that first setup, and how you have to play off the different groups, and all the, what I really like, Bob, is that how you have these different like sort of reaction options, you know, for the judge to go through for each of those factions.
That's right, with all of the NPCs, yeah.
Well, yeah, the first half is very role play heavy, and for something like this, I think that type of adventure works very well. You can take all of these various religious and political themes and run those through those factions, and it just would add even more depth to it. So those were kind of the things that leapt to my mind Shutter Mountains didn't even spring to my mind until Jen mentioned, poverty as a character in the campaign.
Yeah.
And really, I guess that witch that re-enchants the blue star certainly could be Shudfolk.
Yeah, she's very much having
It
those
also-
characteristics.
I mean, could also be a witch from Dying Earth.
Yep.
So that's what I had.
All really good. But that brings us to our DCC feature for the show. And speaking of Lankmar, The Greatest Thieves in Lankmar by the Goodman Games tournament team. So very much a fun, sort of way to tie this in. But Bob, do you want to give us a bit of a overview?
From the most famous city in the history of fantasy comes a sword and sorcery adventure that only the best gamers will survive. The Greatest Thieves in Lankmar is a dungeon crawl classics adventure that sends characters into the hot cellars beneath Thieves' House, across the sooty rooftops of the city of 7,000 smokes, and on to a mad dash through the palace of the Overlord. This box set comes with everything you need to run an epic adventure over several sessions, whether you run it standalone or as part of an ongoing campaign. When you open the box, you'll be in the company of legends. The Greatest Thieves in Lankmar was first run as a tournament at Gen Con 2019, where 20 nationally competitive teams competed over 4 fantastic days and 3 hard-fought rounds. Characters died alone, lost beneath Thieves' House as their torches burnt out one by one. After 44% of the tables experienced TPKs. I'm not exactly sure how you get 44% out of 20 teams, but 44% experienced TPKs, and nearly 6 in 10 PCs were killed. One team survived to win the tournament. How will your players compare?
I'm sorry, I shouldn't give away spoilers like most of them were, Haley.
We really need to hire the movie phone guy to do that.
The reason the 44% math works out is because it's not just the first round where the 20 teams played. It's overall.
Teams can multiple TPK.
Yeah, well, no, it's like some teams got to the second round in TPK, and some teams got to the third round in TPK. So it's multiple rounds of
But
TPK.
we also include all of those stats for you in the box set. Oh yeah, I mean, just they're constantly being chased. They're constantly, like you said, Bob, trying to lay low. They're constantly in these different settings with these different maps, and if you play it in a campaign setting, you have so many opportunities for player agency and NPCs, and that I don't want to say conflict, but you have the option for just so much cooperative storytelling in there. And I mean, Mark, come on, I see your note there, so I'm not going to take it away from you.
Well, there was a point in the Blue Star where our protagonists are having to escape, right? And they start going onto the roofs, and they start going to this, and I was so eager for that moment of like, okay, they're going to be the Lankmar, sort of thing, because this is essentially, it's a rooftop chase, that sort of, start of that whole thing in the Greatest Thieves, where, that's a fun thing, and that I think the tournament offers is these sort of different ways of evasion and different ways of, showing off the chase, not just you're fleeing the dungeon type thing, but you have these kind of like rooftops that you have to run across, or you have to go through these clotheslines of women's undergarments, or all these things that are sort of make it very much a real feeling thing. And that's obviously the Lankmar is very good at doing that. But yeah, I think rooftop chases is just one of the things I really loved about the Greatest Thieves, and I think you could totally have that be part of the Pratt's Blue Star universe as well.
Well, and since it is literally a question in the chat, is there a Lank bar? There is one of the sequences in, I think it's the second round, is a drinking contest at the Blighted Bloom, and again, it's kind of a microcosm of Lankmart's
Now, you say that's like you say it's a bar. We
Well,
know
it's
much more than that, Bob.
well, the blighted bloom, of course, is a brothel in Lankmar.
Which takes place in the book too. It's thematic.
Yes. Oh no, it totally is. It was the blighted bloom was the original, essentially hideout for the campaign playtest characters, and it has since made its way into official publications with
We only
Madame
burned,
Rose
tried
and
to burn
Blighted
it down
Bloom.
twice.
And the fact is that she's going to cheat, and how you make it through the encounter rather depends on how you react to that, because you're strangers here. You're the newcomers that came barging in, and there's a whole lot of people that know Madame Rose a whole lot better than they know you, and they certainly like her a lot more than they like you.
Is your money good here, people? Come on. And of course, the conceit for the greatest thieves in Lankmar is the bauble, right? So somebody has the all-powerful necklace that does different things, or at least one thing really well, just like Blue Star. And
but there are so many powers to the Blue Star. All of the powers it possesses. One. It possesses one.
The idea through the adventure and through the book is to keep the bauble safe, and or depending on your allegiance and alliance, get it to a certain power that be. Powers that be? Yeah, that. Pay no attention to my language here. There's absolutely something magic about the rooftop chase. And the minute we came across that scene in the book, I was like, absolutely, we've got to do this.
Well, the one difference that I can think of between these two is that, the bauble in the Greatest Thieves obviously has this one power, does that well, but we never had any teams try to lose the power of the bauble by becoming unfaithful to their significant other. It would have been interesting if they had,
goals.
and we would have had to come up with something on the fly. Where
we got rules for that.
Yeah,
well,
exactly.
And see, I think of the rooftop scene that I think of in the Blue Star, when they're like, "Oh, we'll just creep out here and we'll wander around. We can't get anywhere." So, to me, that was like very like 1950s, 60s sitcom. Work your way out, work your way back.
But the conclusion of that was we walked a little bit out that way, we hid, and then we walked back.
Yeah, or maybe a little bit of Hitchcock's High Anxiety, but
well, I mean, you can do that in practically
or Vertigo. High Anxiety was the
anyway,
parody.
but
yeah, just
got the mechanics and the map and everything for it with this, and you can't go wrong.
It was fun to run as a tournament, and obviously we had a lot of good feedback on it. It's one of those things that I think players really enjoyed. But I would love to hear tales of somebody running it as part of their campaign. Just as a how integrated it is, right? Because obviously you could have this sort of as a one-off, sort of like you have to go steal something, you have to go through this. But I like really, Jen, that idea of like how do you have this sort of integrated with your rest of your world. Hopefully people are doing that, and hopefully people are enjoying it. In different ways, not just as a pure tournament.
Well, and nothing says Lankmar more than a chase scene, right? I mean, was it Massive Lankmar was the first, then Blasphemy and Larceny, and then Greatest Thieves. Chases are like Lankmar Adventure Gold. Jen, you're muted.
I don't even know how that happened. Sorry. Fate's Fortuitous Folly has a specific chase mechanic to it. I think there was one in
I think we mentioned before, but
aspect was the main one for Gang Lords.
But the gangs of Haddad, that has that mechanic I ever came across. Yeah.
The Uradad stuff from the old Metal Gods had some great chase stuff.
Yeah, don't forget to drop that in our show notes, Bob.
Well, have we covered everything? That
I think we've covered everything. We certainly discussed the book in great detail.
See,
And as
Bob,
a
we found a
reminder-
lot that we could talk about outside the book.
Oh yeah, well, I'm very impressed really by how much there was that that you folks came up with for reskins and the like. And to stat.
It's our job.
I love the book, but I didn't get as much gameable content from it as you did.
And for our newer joiners, our newer viewers here on the Twitch channel, there are content warnings for the book, but not for the game.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you all. We have recently relocated the Sanctum Secorum, and that's caused some delays in our ongoing projects. But the next release from author Ashraf Brandon is due within a week. Look for Bihogo, the patron of cattle on Drive-Thru RPG. Hopefully I pronounced that right, Bob.
I believe so. We haven't gotten the pronunciation notes yet to Jen, so I'm not positive. But that's where I'm at, Bihoga.
In the meantime, this brings our latest season to a close. What we'll be reading next month? We will start season 4 with Lest Darkness Fall by L. Sprague de Camp.
Another one of Michael Moorcock's favorites.
And a co-author on many works with Fletcher Pratt.
Certainly in Cube.
Sorry, Bob. That's a trigger for you, isn't it?
Fingers crossed.
But if you are enjoying the show, please comment on the podcast or help us by posting a review on iTunes or YouTube. Those ratings and reviews help new listeners find the podcast and our community, which is wonderful. Any last thoughts, folks, as before we close out our season? I think this year has been fabulous, for the works that we've covered. For me personally, I've just really enjoyed it, and I'm looking really, forward to next year as well. We're gonna have a lot of fun things.
We do. We've got a lot of great books lined up, and we've got a lot of really good but really fun reading ahead. And I swear to God, I really thought that August Derleth book was better than it was. I swear.
Oh, hilarious.
You can look for Legends of Uganda from Ashraf Braden to land on the Goodman Games online store soon.
Awesome.
Stares questioningly at Jen.
What? When? Soon. That's the normal line. Soon.
We've had redemption for a random joke or random fact from Jen.
Oh, random fact. I don't know how random it is, but we're actually looking for more bookcases because we lost some in our move. So there's kind of random.
That's a depressing fact. We can.
Sorry. The listeners want a random fact about kitties. Idris was visiting us at the beginning of our show, named for Idris Seabright, one of the pen names that Margaret St. Clair used when she first started out. So little Idris was the one being all cute on screen earlier. Sorry.
And if you have read or played Night of the Bog Beast, since that draws some inspiration from a Margaret St. Clair story, there is a little Idris in there as well.
And that was before the cat joined our household or even came into our lives. So there you go. Random weird thoughts. Yeah. All right. I think that's it for us for now, right? We've got Lest Darkness Fall from last one. Be sure to watch, if you haven't already gone to the replay for it, or find it on YouTube or on our website, the Michael Moorcock interview from just 3 days ago.
Which has also already been released as a podcast episode.
Awesome. We got to sit down at the feet of Uncle Mike again to get him to tell some stories.
You call it an interview. That's a rather loose use of it. Michael Moorcock was generous enough with his time and told us a lot about his
Oh.
experience in writing. It was wonderful. But I think we asked 3 questions.
But the answers we got,
I know,
oh
it's
my
just
God.
so wonderful.
There's-
Yeah.
They sweep, yeah.
It's-
They're a little sweeping and
They
little
are, but
calming.
they're so, it's so wonderful. And there's, so I mean, I until that day when I was researching, I did not realize that Michael Moorcock wrote the screenplay for one of my favorite movies growing up, The Land That Time Forgot. And so all, asking about that and all of the detail about how we got the job and anecdotes from the filming, and it's like, I told them there were, I'd do it as long as there wasn't a volcano. I didn't know, and I'm like, I remember a volcano. It's like, I didn't know there was a volcano until they wheeled out the barrels of oatmeal. And there's so many anecdotes and stories.
That's not going to make any sense.
It will when they listen to it, but there's just so much information. It was so wonderful, and he's so generous with his time.
Yeah.
And we got to
Already
talk
looking
about
forward to
his
next.
new book and
Yeah.
what he's going to be doing next year, which is music. It's just fantastic.
And with any luck, we'll get to talk to him in less than a year's time.
I hope
See
so.
how he's doing again.
Here's hoping.
Well, there you have it. We hope we've inspired you. And thank you for listening.
Be
Good night.